Hello, Chris here, the idiot who lost the video recording for Planet of the Daleks, which means we have our very first missing episode of the marathon. Yeah, don't really know what happened. I recorded it along with a few other videos in the same sitting. They all made it from camera to laptop, and this one, which I'm convinced I did, has somehow gone walkabouts and I cannot find it. So that means for this time, we're going to try a different format. Needs must, because I'm now going away on holiday. I haven't got time to re-record this one properly. Hello, my name's Chris. What's yours? Welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through Doctor Who from the very beginning, and you join me as Terry Nation returns to the show. I tend not to miss the Daleks when they depart the show after the evil of the Daleks, it's got to be said, because Doctor Who was very good at moving on from them. But while I do think the show can, nowadays, survive without them, I am one of those fans who think they are a genuinely brilliant creation. Many might say their impact is in their design. Many might say their impact is in their voices. Now, while they are very big factors, I think their greatest impact lies in neither of those things. Not really. I think their greatest impact is firstly in their conception, and secondly in their correct utilisation. An absence would be good for them, so while I hadn't missed them, I was a little bit thrilled to see them in Day of the Daleks, but unfortunately that thrill dissipated very quickly when it became obvious it wasn't a great story and they weren't particularly great in it. So to have them back again so soon isn't as thrilling, but there is perhaps a promise that they'll be used better this time, not to mention that their creator is back writing for them. It's got to be a good thing, right? Well, it is and it isn't. When I say I think their greatest impact lies in their conception, it's as these creatures driven by fierce hatred and xenophobia, and what makes them fundamentally frightening, if indeed they are to you, which, you know, they may not be. It's not their sink plungers, it's not their egg whisks, it's their unreasoning, unsympathetic loathing for anything other. I think Terry Nation was very good at capturing imaginations, harnessing his own fears and hatreds of the Nazis to create this defining monster, which resonated so very loudly with nearly everyone watching the show, to the point where Doctor Who at one point came to be identified almost exclusively by the Daleks. So, as the creator, he does deserve his dues. Even though perhaps the design and vocalisation were down to other people in varying quantities, the notion of the creatures driven in such a way works for a reason, and he was the writer to see that. What he may not have been very good at is pushing himself, and this is where I begin sometimes to lose patience with him as a writer. On some level, it's understandable, not only having created the Daleks, but also continuously being told what a marvellous creation they are, and having that borne out by extensive merchandising and Dalek mania, can go one of two ways, and both of them to one's head. Firstly, feeling very massive pressure to consistently deliver on the promise of the Daleks under such weight of expectation, or, secondly, coasting along because the hard work in creating them in the first place has already been done. Sadly, I think he tended towards the latter occasionally, particularly when he returned to the show in the 1970s. Now, in his defence, his first three Dalek stories each do different things with them, even if I myself think the chase to be quite a bit below average. At least this was a new way of approaching them. Yet when he returns for the Pertwee and Baker years, he certainly needs some pushing to stretch his legs a bit, which he does when nudged into the ballpark which birthed Genesis of the Daleks in a couple of years' time. That said, in my view, there is absolutely no denying that he was capable sometimes of indolence. His Pertwee Dalek scripts are derivative, although there is a case to be made that Planet of the Daleks, the story I am here to talk about, was Nation knowing full well what the viewers wanted, which brings us back to how good he was at capturing imaginations. I first saw this when it was repeated in 1993. Now, I'm not sure of the reason why it was repeated, but as a child, I was glad that it was. It was the first time I saw the Third Doctor with Daleks, and as a child, that was just wonderful. And this memory of it prevents me from being too hard on Planet of the Daleks, because its main reason to exist is pretty much that: Doctor Who and Daleks. The age I am now, That may not be enough to make a good story by itself, but I cannot hold it against the show for giving children what they wanted from it. And even though I may need more than a simple Dr. Dalek run around to really enjoy a story, I still think there are certain things to enjoy from this one. And yes, the presence of the Daleks is one of them. I think, were I to watch this story in isolation, many of its shortcomings would be more apparent, but I am 10 seasons into a marathon, more than 300 episodes deep, and it's this context which actually serves to help this story. In many ways, the Daleks serve as one of the greatest reminders that the Doctor is the same man. With the Dalek story, trademark, being such a Hartnell staple in the 1960s, so with Planet of the Daleks being such a traditional one, and the Daleks being more Dalek-y here than in Day of the Daleks, this all has a very, very strong takeaway that we're still watching the same man and the same show. Something which may go without saying, but it bears repeating, that the show has changed its paradigm several times since we began. So this makes Planet of the Daleks, on some level at least, quite effective. Therefore, I get a kick out of the continuity. Mentions of Skaro, flashbacks to the Thals, even name checks for Barbara, Ian and Susan.
He had 3 companions with him.
Yes, Barbara, Ian and Susan.
All of these are a direct link back to the First Doctor and Hartnell in a jungle not dissimilar to the Skaro we saw in the Daleks. We had the man himself and Troughton in the Three Doctors, a celebration of the show itself in Carnival of Monsters, and with these evocative throwbacks, the birthday year looks set to be continuing. We've got the Doctor definitively back among the stars now, and that in itself is a joy to see. Encountering the Daleks again, but this time in a context which feels a touch more organic, is like the show being given its driving licence again. So yeah, there are things to like in this story. The thing is, I'm just not sure there's enough for me to say that I did actually enjoy it unequivocally. Bernard Horsfall, for example, is great, as I would have expected him to be, but it's just that he feels a little bit wasted here. Our golden duo of Pertwee and Manning are also doing their level best to keep everything moving, even if it is back and forth and up and down. And as the story goes on, I do find myself thinking that the biggest problem it has is actually, sorry everyone, is Terry Nation. Now, even though he created them, I think I have to pledge allegiance to the camp that asserts he did not quite grasp how to use the Daleks as well as other writers might have done. Now, I myself think the reason for that is precisely because he was writing them as he had initially thought of them. And the thing with that is nobody else knows what that was. Not really. Any other writers tackling the Daleks write for what they made of the Daleks when they first saw them, with that famous design complete. That's a Dalek. A writer sees it. A writer writes a Dalek. They're writing the Daleks they saw. But Terry Nation just had these monsters in his head. And he was the only one to have that before they were made. So he writes these xenophobic, murderous, robotic mutants, but without him, the Daleks have actually evolved to something beyond that. They've become the Daleks. Terry Nation didn't design them. Terry Nation didn't provide the voice. So what they ostensibly became was this amazing canvas on which to hang all of these ideas of pure evil, mirroring the show's lead character's pure heroism. And as the creator, it would have been hard to see exactly why they resonated with so many people in however many different ways if you didn't come up with the design and if you didn't decide the voice. All he knows is that his idea did resonate, and this has the effect of feeling a little bit like a step backwards when he gets his hands back on them. Now, I'm only really familiar with his Doctor Who work, and that is very much a mixed bag for me. The Daleks, the Dalek Invasion of Earth, the Daleks Master Plan, and, spoiler, Genesis of the Daleks are all in the region of good to excellent for me. With The Chase, Planet of the Daleks, spoilers, Death to the Daleks and Destiny of the Daleks being poor to average. Now, what this tells me is that when he puts the effort in, he was great. But when he didn't, the stories definitely suffered. Now, I suppose you could say that he'd been great enough to be able to sometimes not put the effort in. If only because Terry Nation's propensity to rest on his laurels and coast severely detracts, in my mind, from what good work he did do, I find myself almost concluding that a little bit he chiselled away at his own legacy. Now, as for whether or not we'd have a show today without Nation, I don't think we would. But then there are many people along the way who have done better work in making sure it didn't go anywhere. Without Nation, we wouldn't have had a show for Letts and Dicks to rehabilitate. We also wouldn't have had a show for Terry Nation to return to and not be very good at sometimes. And as we're discussing Terry Nation's merits and drawbacks, I happen to think they balance each other out. End result, I don't hold him in as much esteem as Sidney Newman, Verity Lambert, Barry Letts and Terence Dicks. He could do it when pushed, no question, but occasionally he was perfectly happy not really trying with Doctor Who, and that's a rubbish attitude to have. And it's only more frustrating when you consider that the bloke really could write when he wanted to. There's a scene in this story which is utterly sublime, in my opinion. The Doctor in the cell with Codol is fantastic, as is the accompanying courage speech. That isn't just a nice bit of writing. it also shows a fundamental understanding of the Doctor as a character. A bit later, when the Doctor thinks Joe's been murdered and he listens to a voice on the recording device looking solemn as solemn can be, I feel like it's further proof of how good Nation could be when he wanted to be. Now, before I finish up on this story in this fairly unusual format for this channel, again, apologies, I'd like to say how good Pertwee actually is in it, all things considered. Now, I say all things considered because he's another one for occasionally being slightly idle when unengaged with the job at hand. But he actually seems to be giving this one his all, and that's despite the fact he wasn't by any account a fan of the Daleks. And I feel like he's been consistent enough for long enough now that I can say I feel like he's left behind anything I might not have liked about his Doctor, and he is now firmly the Doctor I want him to be. His outfit this time is also probably my favourite Third Doctor outfit. It really suits him. So, a mixed bag. It's not a complete disaster, but it's not as good as it could have been either, especially as I get the feeling that it could have been great. 349 episodes down now, and not long after I had to wave farewell to Delgado, I now have to get ready to say goodbye to Jo. She didn't get much of a look in this review, partly because she'll have a larger share next time, and partly because, well, you know I think she's brilliant anyway.
Courage isn't just a matter of not being frightened, you know.
What is it then?
It's being afraid and doing what you have to do anyway.
The crushing feeling when Nation reverts to autopilot after a brilliant moment like the one above. As ever, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this Stop Off on Spyroden, then you know how YouTube works. Please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. It really does help the channel no end. And what do you think of this one? Am I being unfair to Terry Nation, or is this just a knockoff of the Daleks' first story? Is Molten Ice a load of old bobbins getting in the way of you enjoying the story, or does that stuff not really matter in the least? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for the departure of Jo Grant, and I'll firmly be back on camera again. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, clang the cloister bell, and I'll see you at the Nut Hutch.